The history books often speak of the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, the blood-soaked sands of Omaha Beach, or the desperate aerial combat over London. But what of the men who fought where the cameras didn't follow? What of the soldiers who bled in the mountain passes of the Caucasus, the dense jungles of the Arakan, or the desolate islands of the Aleutians, the forgotten fronts of the Second World War, battles you've never heard of? In this episode, we dive into the shadows of the greatest conflict in human history. We look at the units that held the line when the world was looking elsewhere, specifically focusing on the harrowing struggle of the 17th Infantry Regiment during the Battle of Attu in May 1943. While the Pacific War is often defined by palm trees and turquoise water, this was a war of fog, frostbite, and a fanatical enemy who refused to surrender. On a barren rock in the North Pacific, the United States Army engaged in the only land battle on North American soil during the entire war. This is a story of grit, sub-zero survival, and a final, terrifying banzai charge that nearly wiped out an entire division. By early 1942, the Japanese Empire had expanded at a rate that terrified the Allied High Command. While the eyes of the American public were fixed on the devastating losses at Pearl Harbor and the subsequent fall of the Philippines, a smaller, more insidious threat was developing in the North. In June 1942, as a diversion for the Midway operation, Japanese forces occupied the islands of Attu and Kiska in the Aleutian chain. For the first time since the War of 1812, American territory was under the boot of a foreign invader. The strategic situation was dire. If the Japanese could establish air bases in the Aleutians, they could potentially strike the west coast of the United States or disrupt the crucial Lend-Lease shipping routes to the Soviet Union. Yet, for months, the Aleutians remained a forgotten front. The weather was so foul, characterized by the willowas, violent winds that could flip a plane or a tent in seconds, that both sides found it nearly impossible to maintain operations. Enter the men of the 7th Infantry Division. These were soldiers trained in the scorching heat of the California desert at Fort Ord. They were hourglass men, prepared for tank warfare in the sand. But when the orders came down for Operation Land Crab, they found themselves issued inadequate leather boots and thin field jackets, headed not for the tropics, but for the subarctic nightmare of Attu. Opposing them was Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki and his 2,600-man North Sea garrison. Yamasaki was a seasoned commander who knew he could not win a conventional battle against the industrial might of the U.S. Navy and Army. Instead, he withdrew his forces from the beaches and dug into the high ground, the jagged, snow-covered peaks surrounding Massacre Bay and Holtz Bay. He turned the island into a natural fortress of interlocking machine gun nests and hidden mortar pits. The American plan was simple on paper, a two-pronged pincer movement to trap the Japanese in the center of the island. But as the 17th, 32nd, and 184th Infantry Regiments began their approach in May 1943, they realized the terrain was their first and most lethal enemy. The ground was covered in muskeg, a treacherous, boggy peat that looked like solid earth but would swallow a man to his waist or trap a jeep to its axles. By 1400 hours on May 11, 1943, the first waves of the 17th Infantry landed through a thick, milky fog that reduced visibility to less than 10 yards. The silence was eerie. There was no pre-landing bombardment because the fog prevented the battleships USS Pennsylvania and USS Idaho from seeing their targets. The men waded ashore in silence, their boots squelching in the freezing mud. For the first 48 hours, the Japanese remained ghosts. But as the Americans pushed toward the high ground of Jarman Pass, the trap was sprung. From the heights of Cold Mountain and Point 1, Japanese Type 92 heavy machine guns began to chatter. The sound was not the rhythmic thumping the Americans were used to. It was a high-pitched, tearing noise that echoed through the ravines. The temperature plummeted. The leather boots issued to the American GIs soaked through within hours, then froze. Foot trench, a condition that literally rots the flesh off the bone, became as much of a threat as Japanese lead. By May 15th, the 7th Division was suffering hundreds of non-battle casualties. Men were being carried off the ridges not because of bullet wounds, but because they could no longer walk on their blackened, swollen feet. The supply situation was a disaster. Because the muskeg prevented vehicles from moving, every round of ammunition, every sea ration can, and every gallon of fuel had to be carried up the mountains by hand.
The soldiers became pack mules, struggling up 45-degree slopes under constant sniper fire. Little did they know that Colonel Yamasaki was watching them through binoculars from the clouds, waiting for the moment when the Americans were exhausted enough to be broken. The Japanese had spent months tunneling into the volcanic rock. They had warmth, they had dry caves, and they had a singular, fanatical purpose: to die for the emperor and take as many Americans with them as possible. By May 20th, the battle had turned into a slow, grinding war of attrition. Every yard of frozen tundra was bought with blood. By the night of May 28th, the American forces had finally pushed the Japanese back into a small pocket around Chichagof Harbor. To the casual observer, it looked like the battle was over. The 7th Division commanders believed the remaining Japanese were demoralized and near starvation. They were wrong. Colonel Yamasaki, realizing his position was untenable and his supplies were exhausted, decided on a final, desperate gamble. He would not surrender. Instead, he ordered every able-bodied man, and even the wounded who could still hold a grenade, to participate in a massive Senin-gake, or 1,000-man banzai charge. The situation for the Americans in the valley below was precariously thin. The front lines were manned by exhausted infantrymen, while the rear areas were filled with engineers, medics, and support staff who thought they were safe. At 0300 hours on May 29th, the screaming began. Out of the fog, over 1,000 Japanese soldiers descended from the ridges. They didn't just attack the front lines, they poured through the gaps in the darkness. Many were armed only with bayonets lashed to long poles or grenades they intended to use as suicide bombs. Fear gripped the men of the 7th Division as their perimeter collapsed. Medics in aid stations were bayoneted in their sleeping bags. The forgotten soldiers of the 17th Infantry found themselves in a primal hand-to-hand struggle in the pitch black. The deafening roar of artillery was replaced by the screams of banzai and the wet thud of steel hitting bone. An American engineer, Private Joe Martinez, watched as his squad was overrun. The line had broken. The Japanese were heading straight for the divisional command post and the heavy artillery batteries. If they reached the big guns, they could turn them on the American fleet offshore. It was a moment of absolute crisis. Against impossible odds, a disorganized mass of cooks, clerks, and battered infantrymen was all that stood between the Japanese and a total American catastrophe. In the chaos of that early morning, the turning point came down to the sheer determination of individual men who refused to blink. Private Joe P. Martinez of the 32nd Infantry, who would later be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, realized that the only way to stop the tide was to take the high ground back. With an M1 Garand in hand and a pocket full of grenades, Martinez began a solo ascent of a snow-covered trench line. He climbed into the teeth of Japanese machine gun fire, clearing one foxhole after another. His actions inspired the men around him to stop their retreat. Back at the main defensive line, the Americans scrambled to set up a last-stand perimeter. They stripped machine guns from downed aircraft and disabled vehicles. As the sun began to peek through the Aleutian mist, the Japanese found themselves caught in a crossfire in the valley floor. The unexpected solution wasn't a tactical genius move from a general, it was the grit of the American GI. The Japanese charge began to falter as they ran into a wall of .30 caliber fire. Colonel Yamasaki himself was seen leading his men, sword unsheathed, before he was cut down by a burst of fire. What happened next would become legendary in the annals of Pacific warfare, but for all the wrong reasons. Realizing the charge had failed and they were surrounded, the remaining Japanese soldiers did something that horrified the watching Americans. Rather than surrender, hundreds of them pulled the pins on their Type 97 grenades and held them against their chests or heads. The valley echoed with the sound of hundreds of small, muffled explosions.
By the time the mist cleared on the morning of May 30, the Forgotten Front was a landscape of carnage. The sheer scale of the self-destruction was unlike anything the U.S. Army had ever witnessed. The turning point was not just a physical victory, it was a psychological awakening for the Americans. They now knew the true nature of the enemy they would be facing all the way to Tokyo. The Battle of Attu was officially declared over on May 30, 1943. The cost was staggering. Out of the 2,600 Japanese defenders, only 28 were taken alive. The rest were killed in action or by their own hand. The American casualties were equally sobering. The 7th Division suffered 549 killed and over 1,100 wounded. However, the most telling statistic of this forgotten front was the 2,100 men taken out of action by disease and non-battle injuries, primarily trench foot and exposure. The ratio of weather casualties to combat casualties on Attu remains one of the highest in American military history. For their bravery, the 7th Infantry Division received the Distinguished Unit Citation. Private Joe P. Martinez became the first Hispanic American in World War II to receive the Medal of Honor. The historical significance of Attu is often overlooked, but it was the laboratory for amphibious warfare. The lessons learned about cold weather gear, the psychological impact of banzai charges, and the necessity of naval gunfire coordination were applied directly to the invasions of Kwajalein, Leyte, and eventually Okinawa. Attu was eventually abandoned by the military, leaving behind a scarred landscape of rusted Marsden matting, collapsed tunnels, and the silent graves of men who fought for a rock in the middle of the Bering Sea. It remains a testament to the fact that in World War II there were no small battles, only small segments of a global tragedy. The struggle for the Aleutians was just one chapter in a much larger, often hidden narrative of the war. While the 7th Division was freezing in the North Pacific, other forgotten units were fighting equally desperate battles in the mountains of Eritrea, the deserts of Iraq, and the islands of the Indian Ocean. History tends to remember the victors and the grandest stages, but the true face of war is often found in the smaller, more isolated moments. The men who fought on Attu didn't fight for the glory of the history books. They fought for the man to their left and the man to their right, surviving in conditions that challenged the very limits of human endurance. We must remember these forgotten fronts, for they remind us that the cost of freedom was paid in every corner of the globe, no matter how remote or desolate. The bitter wind of the Aleutians still blows over the ridges of Chichagof Harbor, carrying with it the echoes of a conflict that the world almost forgot. This was just one countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to Past History Tales as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.